Welcome to this video. We're going to talk about how to dynamically update our user interface here. So hopefully you're pretty excited about this shiny stuff. It's really useful for displaying your data and letting the user sort of play around with things. And really we can think about it as having essentially two parts, right? So each one of these apps has a UI or user interface, which that file is going to define what the user actually sees and how they're going to interact with your content. And then the server file is really the part that's going to run the R code, create your plots, and anything that R needs to do, essentially. And remember that when we're dealing with these two, we got to know how they talk back and forth. That's going to be really important for how we dynamically update our UI. So we'll talk a bit about that and recap that in just a minute. Another thing that I can't emphasize enough, this is something that I try not to do, or I end up not doing, and it just costs me tons of time. I would really highly recommend it if you are going to create an app from scratch, draw it out on paper, and then write your R code in static form, and then just port it over to Shiny. Things will go much more smoothly for you by and large. So don't be like me. Do this. Actually, do this little bit of tip here. Okay, so what we want to do is dynamically update our user interface. And let's think about how the UI and server talk. We can think about it as essentially having two lists with named objects in them, the input list and the output list. And we can think about just sort of passing those back and forth. So we define all of our different inputs in our UI file. Those get read in the server using input $name. In the output, we create, in the server file, we create output objects. So we do output $give it a name. And in the UI, we reference that name in our different output functions. And so with that in mind, there are sort of three ways to dynamically update your UI. There's a list of update functions that will basically update any of your widgets for you. And then there's a render UI that corresponds to UI output. And this is a really general way to create dynamic content for your UI. And then lastly, we have a conditional panel, which is going to sort of do an if-then logic. So if some condition is true, then we get to see a new panel or a new bit to our user interface. And so we'll walk through each of those and look at an example of each. So first, let's start with the update star functions. So like I said, every one of your input widgets, remember widgets are just things that the user can actually manipulate and change. Every one of those input widgets has a corresponding update function. And so before where we just had, say, numeric input, now it's just update numeric input. And so you can see that they use lower camel case for these things here. One thing that you do have to remember when you're using these things is to include the session argument on your Shiny server function. I often forget this and then I get some errors and I get confused. But if you want to use these update functions, you have to include session so that the Shiny app is able to send this information back and forth as you go. And so one thing to note is that after all reactive things evaluate, that's when the updater actually goes ahead and sends its message back. So it's going to update all the other things in your server file and then deal with these update functions. So here's example syntax for updating a numeric input. And so you can see that it has pretty much all of the same arguments as the numeric input itself has, except that it has that first argument that is session that needs to be there. And then notice that it has null as default values for everything other than the input ID. And then the idea with the nulls is that any argument with a null will be ignored and not be updated. However, anything that you specify for, say, label, value, min, max, or step, those will then be overwritten and sort of dynamically updated. And so one thing that's useful for a couple of these inputs that have different options, like radio buttons and checkbox group input, is that you can clear the choices that are selected by just giving it an empty character vector. Okay, so here's an example of dynamically updating your UI. So I now have a numeric input that allows me to set the maximum number of bins. Maybe I want to set this to be 25. And so now on my slider, I can't go above 25. Change it to 40. Now I can go all the way up to 40 if I want. So this is dynamically changing a part of my user interface. So what's the code that corresponds to that? Well, here is the UI part. And so here I have a slider input and a numeric input. And so remember this first argument to slider input and numeric input, that's the internal name given to these two inputs. And so whenever I want to say update my slider in my server file, I would want to use my update slider input function. I want to reference the appropriate input here. Notice that the only argument I'm changing here in my slider input is I'm saying that the max should be the input from this numeric input here. So max bins value. Now this code wouldn't run, so say I had everything else in here correctly. This code won't run. So take a second and see if you can figure out why this isn't going to run. And so the issue here is that we are accessing an input in our server. And so anytime we access an input, remember that we need to be in a reactive context. And we've only seen basically 3 ways to get into a reactive context. We either use a render function, or we use observe or reactive. And reactive stores something that we would then access later, and so that's not the appropriate thing here. So what we want to do is just wrap this update slider in an observe function. So here, again, this observe creates a reactive context. We are now able to utilize input $max bins, and we are going to update our slider based off of changing the max value from whatever the user specifies for numeric input there. Okay, so let's go ahead and just get a little bit of practice with that. Why don't you open up the template app and try to add a numeric input for the user to specify the largest value of the slider. Go ahead and give that a shot. Don't forget to wrap that thing in an observe. All right, so hopefully you gave this the old college try. Let's try, I'll show you how to make this work successfully. It's really just taking that same code you saw on the slide and applying it here. But let's go ahead and create a numeric input. Give it a name. I'm just going to call it NI. And then we're going to call this max number of bins. And we're going to go ahead and set the default of this at 50. All right, and we might as well set a minimum value for this too. We don't want it to go below 0. So we'll set the min, and actually we'll set the min at 1. All right, so we have that referenced here in our UI file. We jump over to our server file, and we're going to use an observe to get a reactive context, and then we're going to use the update slider input. And we need to give it first the session argument, and now we need to give it the input from our UI, and so we're going to use bins for that. And I don't remember off the top of my head. Let me just check real quick the help for this. Whether this should be, oh, I don't have the shiny package read in. So let's see, is input ID a character string? So it looks like update slider input, yes, so it should be a character string. So go ahead and do that. And now we're going to set the max value to be the input from our UI. So numeric input was the value there. And why don't we go ahead and just set the value to be the value of the slider to be that maximum when we change it as well, just for the fun of it. Okay, so let's go ahead and run this and see if that does what we want it to do. Nope, we have an issue. So, oh, object session not found. So whenever you open this template app, there's no session argument here in the server. So we got to add that, and now we can run it. Oh, got to escape out of that so that we get back our console. Try running it. Okay, so if we're at 50, change it to 49, it changes it to 49. change it to 25, switches it, 250, switches it as well. So we are dynamically updating our slider input here. Wonderful. Next up, let's look at a more general way to update your UI using the render UI and UI output combination. So one thing to notice about these shiny functions that we're dealing with is that they're essentially writing HTML and JavaScript code for us, which is fantastic. So if you just run a print around this command that you see here, you do have to read in the shiny package first. But if you just print out what this command does, it actually just prints out HTML code. Right? So essentially, with this render UI function, we can put that in our server, create any HTML code that we want that is dynamic, corresponding to what the user changes, and send it back to be utilized in the UI. And of course, we would utilize that using the UI output function. Here's just another example of that. If I print a numeric input, for instance, you can see here that we're just getting some HTML style code when this is actually creating the input, the numeric input box that you see. Okay, so again, render UI is a reactive context because it's one of these render functions, and it's going to allow us to create HTML code that can change based off of how the user is interacting. And you can actually return just a shiny tag object, just any old HTML code that you want, or you could return a list of these, so you could actually return more than one thing at a time. I find it easier just to return multiple different render UI objects instead of returning a list of them. Again, if you want to actually change your UI, you're going to correspondingly use the UI output function in the UI file to deal with that. So here's an example where you would update or basically dynamically create your widget to begin with. So notice here in my UI file, that's the top part. In my UI, up here I have a UI output, and then I'm outputting the object slider. And so slider is actually an object that's being created here in server. And what we're doing in server is we're using the render UI function, creating a reactive context, where here we're creating a slider input, which is just going to create HTML code. And notice that I'm here able to access an input setting, so something my user has changed to set my max bins. So again, this would be one way to do it to update that slider input, is actually just create the slider input in the server file as an output object and use UI output to render it. Well, to have it show up. Okay, and here's an example where you might use just HTML code. So in this case, I have my UI output up here in my UI file, and I'm just again outputting the info object that I created in my server file. And what that is, I'm using render UI to get reactive context, and I'm just creating some HTML code. So I'm storing in this text object a pasted strings that is you have selected to buy, and then I'm grabbing a value from the UI. And then I'm returning that as a level 3 header. So that's going to make it larger. So this last thing here is what gets returned and put into my UI there. So it's an H3 third level header with the text you have selected to buy, and then the value of the numeric input for purchase. So again, here's for doing a widget, and here's for doing just any old HTML code. And so here's an example of that actually in the UI. So when I change how many to buy, it dynamically is changing the text that you see here. Okay, so again, good to practice with these kinds of things. Go ahead and open up that template app and try adding some dynamically updating text using the render function. See if you can get that to work, and then we'll go over that example. Okay, back here in the old template app, I'm going to go ahead and create a new output object. So I'm going to do output $, Got to give it a name. I'm just going to call it text. And here I'm going to render UI. So remember, at this point, whatever I return just needs to be something that's going to be coerced into some kind of HTML. And so we might do just a paste of, let's see, what are our inputs? We have number of bins and the max number of bins. So we might do the maximum number of bins is, and then give it the input value of ni. And maybe we would also add period. The selected number of bins is, and then give it input $ bins to give the selected value. Oops, sorry. Okay, so that's going to return that pasted string, but it's going to then be sort of coerced into being some sort of HTML. Actually, why don't we go ahead and make it bigger? So I'll just wrap it in an H2. And with that H2, you could add style. So I could do style, color. Let's do red. See if that'll come out right. And so I called this thing text here in my server file. Jump back to my UI. I need to place this in here somewhere. Let's go ahead and do it in the sidebar. We'll do, let's see, UI output. We're just going to call, oops, not bins, we called that text. Let's see if that works. Aha, there it is. So now when I change this, it's changing those two values that you see there. The last way we're going to look at to update your UI is looking at this conditional panel function. And so this is a function that you would put in your UI file. It's going to basically do if-then logic. So if some condition is true, we're going to then add other UI elements that we specify. And so this condition can depend on either an input or output value. Either way is fine. But a little bit of an issue here is that we do have to change our syntax a bit. We're going to use a dot instead of a $, and we'll see what that looks like in just a second. So just an example of a conditional panel. So this is a plot of the diamonds dataset from ggplot2. And so if I just do a regular old scatter plot, I don't see anything else over here in my sidebar. If I switch to histogram, I now have a new panel that shows up. So this is a conditional panel where if this plot type is histogram, this shows up, which gives you different ways to select the number of bins here, the default number of bins. And then if you select custom, we get another panel that shows up. So that's another conditional panel within that upper one where we then can choose the break count. So let's look at the syntax for doing something like that. So this would be our UI file and specifically the sidebar panel part. So of course we're going to have our select input for the plot type. So this is our internal name for it, plot type in lower camel case. This is the label we see, and then here are the choices, scatter, hist. And this is actually a way to do different names that would show up versus what it's referenced internally. So this is what shows up, the scatter with the capital S. But internally we would use lowercase s. Similarly here for histogram. So now we come on down here and we say, well, if we choose histogram, which is actually the value hist, note, we want to get a new panel that shows up that allows us to select the type of breaks that we want to use for our histogram. Okay. And so we're going to use conditional panel. Notice again we're just using a comma. So now conditional panel is my next possible object. And I need to give it as an argument the condition that I'm going to use. And so the condition here is I'm going to compare my plot type value from my input. So remember we called that thing plot type in lower camel case. So we're doing input dot plot type, and we're comparing that to the value hist that you see right here. Okay. Now it is annoying that they didn't make this a $. I'm sure that they had their reasons for it. The dot is JavaScript notation, so Perhaps there was some issue with using a $ in JavaScript. I don't know that very well. So we do have to remember to switch to using dots within this condition that we see here. Okay, so now if that condition is true, whatever we put after this comma will then show up. And so in this case, we're going to have a select input based off of that condition. If it's true, we're going to see this breaks, select input, internal name first, label second, then here are the possible values it can take on. And then notice that we have another comma after that. So this is still within this first conditional panel. Notice that this second parenthesis here, it just ends the select input. So still within that conditional panel, we now have another conditional panel where if our input dot breaks, so again, that's what we call this thing here, if that's equal to custom, then we're going to have a new slider input as well. And then we're closing that conditional panel, we're closing the outer conditional panel, and then we're finishing up the sidebar panel there. So that is all of the code that is required to create what you see over here, where these things only show up under certain conditions. Pretty cool, I hope you think. Again, the one thing that's kind of annoying here is we do have to remember to do input dot or output dot rather than $. Okay, so here's another good time to pause the video, go to that template app and try to add some kind of new UI element and go ahead and make it based off of a condition on the slider. So if the slider is a value that's small or big or something like that, try to add a new UI element that would show up. All right, back over here in R, let's go ahead and try to use this conditional panel. And rather than putting it in the sidebar, just because we can, I'm going to go ahead and put this in the main panel. But I'm going to go ahead and put conditional panel, conditional, if I can spell, conditional panel. First thing we want to do is give it the condition of interest. So condition, let's say input.bins, because this is our internal name for the slider input. We have to use a dot since we're using the conditional panel. So input.bins, let's say if it's greater than 25, let's do something. In that case, let's go ahead and print, well, let's go ahead and put some text. So H4, there are a lot of bins. Exclamation point. We're excited about that. And let's just see if that works. There are a lot of bins, but now if I go below 25, that disappears. So we now have a new a value that shows up, a bit of our UI that shows up only based off this condition. All right, so we have these three different ways to dynamically change our UI. Our update star functions, which are really just a convenient way to update your widgets. Render UI and UI output, which is a really general way to create any kind of HTML that's dynamic. And then conditional panel, which based off of either a condition from your input or output can make different parts of the UI show up. All right, the last thing that I want to talk about in this video is having a more advanced layout for your particular page. We will talk about doing dashboards in the next video. So if you recall that the contents of our UI, it's wrapped in a fluid page function, and then content within that can be wrapped in what are called fluid rows. So just remember that fluid page is essentially a way that allows our page to change how it shows up based off of sort of what device or what size window people are looking at your slides at, or sorry, your app in. So if they're looking at it on their mobile phone, it will look differently than if they're looking at it on a web browser for the most part. And so fluid page is generally the larger function that you're going to use for your whole page of your app. And then within that, you could actually create fluid rows. And within a fluid row, you can have columns. And so each column, your columns for a particular row just need to sum up to 12. And if you've ever done any kind of web page creation in the last 5 or so years, this Bootstrap template and Bootstrap code is really the most common way to create web pages these days. and that's all that this is. It has the same idea where you're creating columns and they need to sum to 12 in total width. So for instance, here's a very customized layout where I have a fluid row up here in the top. The first column looks like it's maybe 2 wide. The second column maybe 8 wide, and then this other one over here, well, it must be a little bit more than that. So maybe 2, 6, and then 4 for this last one. Below that, I have a second fluid row, and this fluid row has 2 columns in it. The first column is of width 6. The second column is also of width 6, but within that column, we actually have another fluid row that has subcolumns in it. Within here, again, the subcolumns would need to sum to 12 since it's in its own fluid row. So you can get by with sort of the default layouts that you see in RStudio, in the Shiny package, and there are a couple more that we haven't talked about. We've only talked about that sidebar layout. But understanding this idea of fluid rows and the columns can allow you to basically create any kind of layout that you want. If you're interested in the code that creates this, let's try to remember what we're seeing at the top. A fluid row, first column, second column wider, third column a little bit smaller. So we go in here to our UI, a fluid page wrapped around all of this stuff. We have a fluid row with 3 columns. Within the columns, we can basically put our UI elements. Okay? So instead of a quoted string of text here, of course, you could just put a widget. You could put an output from your server file, whatever you want to put. You might notice here that there is a line across the middle. So in that case, I'm using a fluid row, and in that row, I'm just putting a horizontal rule, so a line. This is just sort of some HTML style code. But again, for that second row down here, we have a column of width 6, and then a second column of width 6 that has its own fluid rows in it. So again, very customizable. Okay, so that is going to wrap up this video. What we really looked at here, of course, is just updating your UI dynamically. In the next video, we will talk about dashboards and how to create those with different packages and just different things from the base Shiny package.